Hi, it's Allie, and this week we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into some of 1960s American history. We've already looked at the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and that happened, of course, November 22nd, 1963. And we also saw the accused murderer of JFK be killed on live television when Jack Ruby shoots Lee Harvey Oswald and murders him. And so we've seen quite a bit of violence happening on our television screens and in American society at this time. And I just kind of want to set the stage for our studies this week, which will be in the late 1960s, with a real focus on 1968. So we have that assassination of John F. Kennedy, a beloved, young, charismatic American president. And we also, in 1965, February 21st, there's the assassination of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X was a black leader. I actually went to an alternative high school here in Madison, Wisconsin, where I currently live, called Malcolm Shabazz City High School. And he was a black Muslim and an activist. He was really interested in not just civil rights, but also he was looking at how class impacts black Americans. And also in 1965 is when America starts sending combat troops to Vietnam. By the end of 1969, there's a draft lottery, and we'll look at a clip of that in our class. But prior to the lottery format, which was televised, and men would find out if they had been selected to serve, there was already a draft board system in place. So there's Americans being drafted at this time for a war that people don't know a whole lot about, and they're not really certain sometimes even where Vietnam is. So there's a real high level of uncertainty happening prior to 1968. And then when we get to 1968, as we'll see in our studies this week, the Tet Offensive occurs January 30th, 1968. And this is a real turning point in the war in Vietnam. Walter Cronkite is over there broadcasting what's happening, and he is really showing a realistic portrait of the war, and it's not that great. There was a lot of casualties at the Tet Offensive on the American side, and it's a real stalemate in the war. And Walter Cronkite, he's a pretty honest guy. He shows that. And LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, the president of America during this time period, he said when he lost Cronkite, he lost Middle America. And so that's the power of a televised news journalist that's trusted. And we already saw that when we looked at McCarthyism and the impact that Fred Friendly and Ed Murrow had. So again, that's the beginning of the year in 1968, and this is one of the most tumultuous years in a very turbulent decade in American history. And so January 30th is the Tet Offensive. By March 31st, just a couple months later, LBJ Lyndon Johnson announces he will not run for re-election for the president of the United States. And so you can really see the impact of losing Middle America on LBJ's political career. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and this is a huge moment in American history. And he had the "I Have a Dream" speech had been broadcast on television. King's funeral will be broadcast. We will look at clips of that this week in our studies. And riots break out in inner cities across America with the news of this beloved black leader and activist's murder. Also, shortly after that, June 6th, 1968, RFK is assassinated. So, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, is making a bid for that presidential seat that Lyndon Johnson has decided not to run for re-election. While he's on the campaign trail in California, he is assassinated, and we will watch clips of this. The funeral train, RFK's funeral train, I show a clip of that every time I teach this class. and it moves me to chills, to almost tears every single time I watch it. So these are really impactful figures who are being assassinated in this time period. And 1968, it's just like figure after figure. There's people are starting to think, little children in this time period are starting to think that part of being a political figure in America is having an assassination be how you die. That's how commonplace this was starting to be. And then we get to August 1968, the Democratic National Convention. And I'm standing here next to a painting I painted of Abbie Hoffman. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin are the leaders of the Yippies, the Youth International Party. And they're prominent activists organizing a lot of what is happening out on the streets of Chicago during the Democratic National Convention of 1968. And the police presence in Chicago and the clash with student protesters, when Chicago police start beating up the student protesters, they turn to the television camera and they start chanting, "The whole world is watching." And we'll look at that a little bit more in depth, how the camera impacts events, when I look at the observer effect in our lecture next week. But I just want you to be aware of the level of tragedies, the level of trauma being witnessed on our television screens in the decade of the 1960s, and in particular 1968. I have a quote here by Abbie Hoffman: "A modern revolutionary group heads for the television station." And so this is the young people of the Youth International Party, Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin. They knew the power of the medium at this time. So as television is broadcasting the events, they knew how to wield the television in their favor. And so this is all something to look at. And I hope that you find our studies here about like it's a true revolution happening in America in the 1960s, where civil rights, feminism, and the student protest movement really change American society, and we will start to see the differences in what we see on our small screens as early as the late 1960s with shows like Julia, and then in the 1970s we'll start looking at socially relevant sitcoms, and you'll start to see how the news of the day becomes commonplace even in fictional programming. Thank you so much for your attention.